Hey guys, welcome back. In this episode of Deep Dive, we're returning once more to the weirder side of UFO history. This time, I'll be sharing a story from Scotland that doesn't quite gel with the usual, stereotypical close encounter, because when most people think of close encounters, other than the movie, they likely imagine beings that look like this, somewhere in this country, either imparting knowledge, doing shady experiments, or extracting DNA. But in this instance, not only do the beings close contact did not appear anything like the above, but they became the subject of an official police investigation that would immortalize this event as the only really interesting thing to ever happen to the Scottish town of Livingston, and created Britain's most famous pair of trousers. And because I couldn't really think of a title, well, it's this. So this is the bit where I'm going to give a bit of background on Livingston, so pretty much this is going to be, like as boring as you can imagine. But I'll try my best to make it interesting anyway, which is a fucking uphill battle. Alright. So, originally founded in the 12th century for the vast majority of its mostly sleepy existence, the Scottish village of Livingston was a place where, with one very notable exception, nothing terribly interesting ever happened. Very much an in-between place, situated 15 miles from Edinburgh and 29 miles from Glasgow.
Excuse me, mate, is it two Glasgows full of specky bams? Cough, ya prick.
Historically, Livingston was a place where travellers could grab an ale or a night's kip before their journey, pay to use the toll roads, and not much else. Being a little bit harsh on Livingston here for the sake of comedy, obviously it existed in one form or another for a very, very long time. There is history in this town, and I'll leave a link to the below video by a passionate local of Livingston giving a much more detailed overview of its old and new landmarks. But for the sake of this video's length, I'd like to emphasise that nothing actually exciting ever happened in Livingston. Until, that is, one day in 1979, which, give me a minute, I'm getting to it. So after World War II, the UK government enacted the New Towns Act, which allowed them to designate large areas of land for town development. They then formed and gave authority to quango organisations called development corporations, and these guys basically oversaw and developed new towns for the purpose of reducing overcrowding in major cities, many of which had been heavily damaged in the Blitz or were just falling apart due to urban decay, and to accommodate what was predicted to be a post-war baby boom. The new towns would not only provide a place for these babies to be raised safely, but also encourage economic growth and the establishment of new industries. Over the course of the next couple of decades, dozens of these new towns were created across the United Kingdom.
Damn it! Who typed a question mark on the teleprompter?
5 were in Scotland, including Livingston, which was incorporated in 1962 by the Livingston Development Corporation, or LDC. Merging 6,692 acres of land, comprising the historic Livingston village, 2 nearby small villages, several small farmsteads, and a population of around 2,000 people into the new town of Livingston. In their first annual report to the Secretary of State for Scotland in 1963, Sir David Lowe, the chairman of the Livingston Development Corporation, outlined the LDC's ambitious plans.
The Livingston Development Corporation will undertake to make Livingston a self-contained, vital and happy community of some 100,000 people enjoying all that is best in gracious living.
Bloody no!
And I swear to God, this will get interesting at some point this century, I swear. Just hang on. So anyway, over the course of the next 17 years, the LDC worked tirelessly to develop Livingston's infrastructure, roads, commerce and industry. The LDC also took on large projects such as housing schemes, a football stadium, train stations, and a hospital. And the town's population grew as residents moved in. By 1979, the LDC employed most of the town, and those not employed by the LDC directly probably were employed by companies that only existed in Livingston because of the LDC. One of the LDC's many employees was Robert Bob Taylor, and on November 9th, 1979, an event took place that would make Bob Taylor and his thick winter jeans the most famous thing to ever happen in Livingston. Robert Bob Taylor, a 61-year-old lifelong forestry worker, World War II vet, and currently an employee of the Livingston Development Corporation, woke on the morning of November 9th, 1979, ate some breakfast, and then left the cottage he shared with his wife Mary in Deans at 7:45 a.m. to complete various odd jobs around town. Bob had no idea that today's events would change his life forever and catapult his trousers to worldwide stardom. He returned home mid-morning for a spot of breakfast and to collect his red Irish setter, Lara, before heading out in his Bedford truck to search the nearby newly planted forest around the hills of Decmont Law for stray cattle and sheep. 10:30 a.m. The woods were quite muddy, so Bob and Lara left the vehicle and proceeded to walk the dense woods on foot. Upon rounding a corner into a clearing where the trees fell away on either side, Bob claims to have seen a 20-foot wide dome-shaped object resting on the ground before him. It had a brimmed rim in the middle, set with what looked like antennae or propellers. It was made of what looked like shiny grey metal, with a rough surface and dark, irregular-shaped holes along the top portion that may have been portholes. According to Bob, the top section of the object was alternating between being fully solid and semi-transparent, as if it were trying to cloak itself. Bob stared in stunned silence and horror at the floating otherworldly object for a moment. Other than the sound of his dog, Lara, barking furiously, the clearing was strangely silent. Then, two smaller spheres, described by Bob as 3 feet in diameter and with about 6 spiky protrusions, like old naval mines, fell from the rear of the object with a clunk and began to roll towards him, making little sucking sounds in the mud. Bob stood frozen in horror and disbelief as the spiky balls approached him by roll-walking on their spindly legs. Each latched onto one of Bob's legs and hooked into his thick winter jeans and began to pull him towards them and the larger sphere. Bob recalled crying out in pain and fear and smelling a strong, choking smell of burning brakes, and then he passed out. He came to 20 minutes later to find himself alone in the clearing, disheveled, muddy, with a splitting headache, a dry throat, and a burning sensation on his chin. The object was gone. Most importantly, and I'd like to emphasize this, the dog was okay. Bob, however, was in a bad way. Bob stumbled and crawled 100 yards back up the wooded path to his truck and tried to use the radio for help. But when he tried to speak into the two-way radio, he found he'd completely lost his voice. He jumped in the truck and tried to drive home, but he was so shaken up that he ended up reversing it into a ditch and stumbling home through the woods and fields on foot. 11:15 a.m. Mary Taylor opened the door to see her husband muddy and disheveled with torn trousers. Her first thought was that he'd had an accident with his truck, but instead he told her that he'd been attacked by a spaceship thing. Her response, "There's no such thing as spaceships, you must have hit your head, I'm going to call the doctor." Which, fair enough, that's what I want someone to say to me if I start saying that I've been attacked by a spaceship too. But I digress. Mary called Bob's boss at the forestry department of the LDC, Malcolm Drummond, and his family doctor, Dr. Gordon Adams. Both men arrived at roughly the same time and listened patiently to an obviously distressed Bob tell his story of being attacked. Neither Bob's boss nor his doctor thought that he was lying. Bob had a solid reputation in the community as a World War II vet, a teetotaler, and a hard-working, honest man. He wasn't given to flights of fancy. After Dr. Adams urged Bob to travel to the closed Bangor hospital, Bob waited for only 2 hours before discharging himself and leaving, possibly because the view from the hospital looked out at the exact spot on the tree line where he'd had his traumatic experience just hours earlier. When Drummond arrived back at the house and announced that he and his forestry workers had found no trace of what Bob had seen, Bob insisted there definitely were markings where he'd been attacked. So both men went back to the woods, and with Bob leading the way, they soon arrived in the clearing where there were clear signs on the ground that something had happened. Malcolm Drummond's description of what he saw. In the center was something like caterpillar tracks, surrounded by deep triangular marks the size of a horse's hoof. There is no doubt in my mind that these marks were made by a perfectly solid, heavier-than-air object. They had been made by some machine which had come vertically downward. However, even though Drummond was amazed at the sight of the tracks in the ground which seemed to confirm Bob's story, he was very skeptical that the tracks had been made by some sort of spaceship, thinking it more likely that Bob had instead been attacked by a man-made object, likely some kind of helicopter or other experimental flying machine belonging to the government, perhaps. At this point, Bob had to pack up and leave for the weekend as he and his wife had prior plans to travel down to England for a family holiday. And in most versions of Close Encounter tales, this is where the story would end, but it seems that Malcolm Drummond had other ideas. He not only called the Livingston police on Bob's behalf to report the attack, but he, or someone else in the LDC, then made the first of several phone calls to the media. I'll speculate later as to why Malcolm Drummond may have made these calls. It's weird enough to me that someone's boss would call the police on their behalf to report an attack by aliens, let alone the press. Bob's story likely would have been something only told to his closest friends and family. But through the intervention of Malcolm Drummond, the whole world would soon know about Bob and his trousers. Within hours of Bob's attack, PC William Douglas of Lothian and Borders Police, along with 6 other officers, including Detective Sergeant Ian Walk, Detective Sergeant Stuart MacDonald, and Superintendent William David Scott, met Malcolm McDrummond at the scene of the incident. By the time they arrived, Malcolm McDrummond had already arranged for the area where Bob had seen the object to be fenced off with chicken wire, and for Bob's truck, undamaged, to be returned to the depot. The police were skeptical of the story relayed by Malcolm Drummond, but it had been reported to them as an assault, so they proceeded with their investigation as such. Apparently, after taking Drummond's statement, Superintendent William David Scott simply shook his head and said, "When I came on duty at 2 o'clock, I didn't have a care in the world. Now look at this." The police noted that there were around 40 holes or indentations in the ground in a circular pattern, with 2 treadmill-like markings inside the circle. They noted that the treadmill tracks were similar to that of a caterpillar truck, and were deep enough to indicate that an object likely to have weighed several tons had rested there. Their first thought was whatever had made the indentations would need to have been carried in by something big, like a mobile crane. But there were no tracks heading to or from the area, so, like Drummond, they assumed that whatever had made the tracks had either come down and left vertically, or had been carried to and from the location in ways unknown. 6 p.m. The police next visited the LDC Estates Department and examined Bob's truck. They didn't find any indication that Bob had been in an accident, perhaps assuming he could have hit his head, and there was also nothing on board that might have given off fumes and thereby caused hallucinations. Morning, November 10th. The following day, Mr. Drummond was interviewed by journalists from the Livingston Post and Scottish Evening News on Bob's behalf. The story was also heavily covered by local radio stations. Whether Bob and Mary Taylor, currently taking a trip to get away from the whole situation, are aware that these interviews with the press are being carried out on their behalf or not, the stories are like the bat signal to every journalist, ufologist, and UFO skeptic in Scotland, if not Britain, and they all start making plans to arrive, some the very next day. Speaking of which, on Sunday Bob returned from his trip a very busy man. When ufologist Malcolm Robinson interviewed him at his house that day, he described the place as already overflowing with journalists, with Mary Taylor running about making cups of tea for them, and Bob offering to take them on guided tours of the site where he'd been attacked. PC Bill Douglas of Lothian and Borders Police visited Bob around 7 p.m, noting that he was still visibly shaken. Although he was pretty skeptical of the whole story, something he made pretty clear to Bob in no uncertain terms, he ultimately believed Bob was telling the truth, and although he wasn't entirely sure what had happened, he found that there was enough evidence, like the ripped trousers and cuts and bruises, that an assault had taken place, and that the case should as such be taken seriously. He interviewed Bob, took his statement, and then collected the clothing he'd been wearing that day and sent it away for forensic examination. The results from the forensics would eventually corroborate part of Bob's story, showing that his trousers had indeed been hooked to some sort of device and pulled vertically and forward. The case was then deemed serious enough to be taken over by CID, Criminal Investigation Department, with Bill Douglas later remarking, "Before all this happened, I wasn't really a believer, but now I have to think, are we the only planet with intelligent beings on it? There must be something else out there." November 12th. By Monday, the reports in the Sunday newspaper had more journalists and ufologists scrambling to Livingston to interview Bob or to take photos of the site. He was even further inundated for interviews, so much so, investigators by this point were even sleeping on his floor. I like to think at this point, his house probably looked like Bilbo's when Gandalf turns up and all the dwarfs take over the place and start eating all of his sausages. November 14th. By Wednesday, Bob was still humouring journalists and ufologists and still conducting tours of the site, which was now covered in a fresh topping of snow, when Andrew Collins and Martin Keatman, investigators for UFOIN, that's UFO Investigation Network, and BUFRA, British UFO Research Association, arrived to interview Robert Taylor and Malcolm Drummond, so many dozens of journalists, ufologists, and looky-loos had visited the site and climbed over the chicken wire erected by the LDC that someone had even built a snowman. Nevertheless, they scanned the area with a Geiger counter and didn't pick up anything unusual, nor did a quick scan for magnetic anomalies. Despite the area being heavily trampled by then, they also took soil samples from the immediate area, as well as control samples from the surrounding area, and sent these away for analysis at Leeds University. The tests would later come back showing nothing of interest. November 15th. On Thursday, Andrew and Martin interviewed Superintendent Scott, who said that as long as no new evidence appeared, the police basically considered the case closed.
I just torched a building downtown and I'm afraid I'll do it again.
Oh, yeah, right. I'll just type it up on my invisible typewriter.
We know from the reports that would eventually release that although the CID investigation continued at this point, the lines of inquiry were mostly medical, with CID conducting interviews with Bob's doctor and poring over his past medical records.
Oh.
November 22nd, almost 2 weeks later, the official police forensic report on Bob's clothing was released, with police forensic scientists Lester Knibb and Jennifer Hendry examining Bob's jumper, socks, vest, pants, pullover, and of course, the notorious trousers. Nothing of significance was found on the clothing other than mud, scratches from scrambling through the woods, and an unknown white substance that was similar to maize starch. The trousers and long johns were both torn. The forensic scientists concluded that whatever had made the tears had exerted an upwards force on the clothing it tore, leaving a distinctive S-shaped pattern on Bob's kegs. They noted that there was no trace of burning. January 7th, 1980. On the 7th of January the following year, CID Livingston released their official statement on the incident, ultimately concluding that although there was physical evidence at the scene of the alleged attack, they couldn't determine what had created that physical evidence. The report goes a long way to say that Bob is a trustworthy person that wouldn't make such things up. But it does subtly imply that Bob hallucinated the event, pointing out that he had had meningitis 14 years earlier and had reported suffering headaches earlier that year in July. The report doesn't say it outright. The suggestion is that Bob suffered a hallucination that was somehow connected to having had meningitis 14 years prior and having headaches 4 months earlier. And with that, the world's first police investigation of a UFO sighting as an assault came to an end, with the police citing no reasonable further lines of inquiry. But although police interest had mostly dried up, it would be a long time before public interest would. And although the incident was over, Bob's trousers would live on in infamy. In the 45 years since that incident on Decmont Hill, Bob's story has been told an astounding amount of times, in multiple languages, in print, in television, in countless YouTube videos, retelling the same story again and again and again and again and again. Sometime around 1982, 3 years or so after the attack and subsequent media storm, Bob retired from the LDC and moved to Blairgowrie. He occasionally met with journalists and ufologists and even agreed to try hypnotic regression, although he couldn't remember anything new while under hypnosis. Although Bob sometimes made an appearance in the various retellings, usually in archive footage, he clearly took a step back from it all. There were stories of anomalous events occurring around Bob's house in Blairgowrie in the 90s, such as reports from his neighbours of a large UFO flying over a field near Bob's house, followed by the appearance of crop circles 2 years later. But Bob never saw any of this himself and seemed to have no opinion. It's unclear if Bob was just tired of talking about the whole event. I tend to think he was, based on my previous videos around this sort of thing, and it seemed like he basically retired from having to retell the story one more damn time. He seemed content to pass the baton on to the researchers to continue on while he enjoyed his retirement. But his trousers, well, that's a whole different story. If there were a tier list for the world's most notorious trousers, clearly Danny Glover's trousers from Predator 2 would be number 1. Like, what even are they? Like, I don't understand what Danny Glover's proportions are that he would fit into these, but clearly, obviously the reason why he was targeted by the Predator. In a close second place, Bob's trousers from 1979. They're a British heirloom, They're almost on par with the Crown Jewels. They've made more TV appearances than ad breaks at this point. They've been on the BBC more often than Kim Kardashian. I mean, I could go on. And you know what? Screw it, I'm just gonna make my own famous trousers tier list because I'm an adult and I can do whatever I want, nobody can stop me. Bob's trousers had quite a storied life. After they were returned by the police, they were given by Bob to Malcolm Robinson, the UFO researcher who'd been there almost a day after the incident, and in 1988, Malcolm tried to have the trousers tested by psychics. Although this mostly fell apart as the trousers had become too famous and any psychic would know what they were, so any results wouldn't be, considered reliable. Nevertheless, 2 psychics came up with hits. The first held the trousers, then grabbed a pen and drew a semicircular disc-shaped object emitting pulsing rays and wrote the words blob-like jelly creatures and burnt smell. The second presented a much more detailed vision. They claimed to see 3 small people speaking in a high-pitched language with Bob's dog passed out before them. They also claimed that the 3 people had stuck a needle in Bob's immobilized right eye. Nightmare fuel. They also claimed that the aliens were chatting about going back to Venus. I don't know how the psychic would know this if they were speaking in a different language, but, they also then said something about eating a pie, so I think we can throw this one right out the window. I don't know, man, this is the most unhinged psychic prediction I've read since Christopher Walken in The Dead Zone.
The ice is gonna break! I want you out of here.
The next thing to happen totally justifies all the money I spent buying these stupid books. Because in 1992, while Malcolm was having an argument with his girlfriend, she grabbed the trousers and she held a pair of scissors to them, causing him to fall to his knees and beg her not to destroy them. And at this point in the book, I genuinely had to laugh out loud at how much of a hold these trousers seem to have on this man. There's some real Isildur refusing to destroy the One Ring energy in this fucking quote. In 1992, Malcolm and his group, SPI, that's Strange Phenomena Investigations, encouraged the LDC to lay a plaque or a monument at the site of the incident. Not only would this draw in tourists, it would also make it a lot easier for people to actually find the location where it happened because ufologists kept getting lost in Livingston and having to ask kids for directions. The LDC agreed to erect a monument and a plaque and promised to let them know when it was going up so a ceremony could be held. However, this didn't happen. The plaque was erected without any fanfare and without the LDC even telling anyone where it was. And the wording on the plaque was also very odd. Rather than reference the event that happened, the plaque referenced an episode of a TV show about the incident. More strange when you consider that the only reason anyone knows about the incident is because the LDC pushed so hard for a police investigation and media presence. In any case, it was a moot point as over the next 24 years the sign was stolen so often that eventually they just stopped replacing it. The LDC was eventually dissolved in 1997 when Livingston lost its Newtown status and came under the remit of West Lothian Council. In 2018, West Lothian Council put up a new plaque and built markers and posts and display boards, essentially creating a UFO trail for tourists and enthusiasts to walk in Bob's footprints. And if you'd like to see Britain's most famous trousers, the only physical evidence of not only alien contact but alien violence, corroborated by the police no less, then you can probably just travel to Livingston and join Malcolm on a guided tour sometime, because he quite often brings them the precious trousers. When I started this video, I set out to add a book written by a believer and a book written by a skeptic, as well as a host of other reputable sources and all sorts of random facts and bits and pieces. For the UFO believer, I went with the obvious choice. Nobody knows this case better than Malcolm. He was there from the beginning, and with his reporting starting almost the very next day of the incident. Not only did he stay in touch with Mary and Bob throughout their lives, he remained on very good terms with them, acting as almost a spokesman for the family to protect them from further press intrusion. Also, he is the keeper of the trousers. For the skeptic, the choice was also obvious. Stuart Campbell has been investigating this case for as long as Malcolm and has written about it almost as extensively. Malcolm has done a fantastic job at documenting Decmont and every aspect of the case in incredible detail. He's collected nearly every scrap of detail around the Decmont case, from the original police reports to nearly every newspaper clipping, and has been present for every development in the case since 1979. Most importantly, for the last 40 years, keeper of the trousers. an astounding number of theories put forth by mostly skeptical and science-based theorists. Many of these are written about in Malcolm's book, so if you'd like to see more detail around any of them, you're best off purchasing his book, which is far and away the most comprehensive retelling of the event. And it's only $1.99 on Kindle, and you can even get it for free on Kindle Unlimited if you have Prime. Then there's Stewart's book, which he does start by saying he won't consider the extraterrestrial hypothesis in any of his theories, no matter what. So he's very much like Scully to Malcolm's Mulder in this story. He covers a lot of famous UFO cases from Lonnie Zamora and Kenneth Arnold. Again, watch Saucer Named Floyd for more info on these guys.
Hang out, watch a movie.
But mostly he comes to the same conclusion as Project Blue Book in most cases, even though we know many of these conclusions were heavily suspect, and Dr. J. Allen Hynek, Blue Book's resident astronomer, would eventually feel pretty shameful about using such conclusions at the expense of credible witness testimony. It is what it is. With that out of the way, let's get into the theories. Now there are many theories to go through, so I'm just going to lump similar theories together by category and touch on the most likely scenarios for each possible type of explanation. If you want to see every possible theory covered in great detail, including a great many I haven't included here, or this video would be as long as my Saucer Named Floyd video that nobody watched, again, buy Malcolm's book. Starting with astronomical. The most logical place to start when looking for a reasonable explanation for a UFO sighting is the sky, specifically the appearance of any potential astronomical phenomena at that time. According to Stuart Campbell's astronomical mirage theory, such a rare astronomical phenomenon may have happened at around 10:30 am on November 9th, 1979. In Stuart's theory, a sudden temperature inversion could have caused rare atmospheric lensing and distorted and magnified the planet Venus so that it appeared huge and dome-like. When Bob rounded the corner into the fateful clearing, he saw the planet Venus huge and right in front of him. The two metallic balls that attacked Bob weren't aliens, Stewart claimed, but likely other celestial objects such as the planet Mercury and/or the star Antares, also magnified by atmospheric lensing and appearing to be rushing from behind the larger object towards him. The spokes of the object were likely caused by corneal fibers and astigmatism, as the pupils of his eyes opened in heightened interest at what he was seeing. Subsequently, Stewart claims, the flickering and flashing lights from the mirage, along with just the right combination of surprise, fear, and bloody unusualness, may have triggered an isolated fit of temporal lobe epilepsy, something, Stewart pointed out, Bob was at greater risk of having due to his history of meningitis. Stewart also pointed out that, as well as a hallucination and acrid taste in the mouth, a fit would explain the period of unconsciousness, grogginess, and inability to speak or move properly that Bob experienced immediately after seeing the objects. Stewart also has answers for the tracks that were left behind. According to him, although confusing to investigators, they were likely coincidental and not even connected to what happened. Stewart, like Malcolm, had actually visited the site in the days after it first happened, and he'd seen the tracks firsthand. According to him, the markings didn't look like something had landed or driven there, but more like simple equipment had been left resting in the clearing long enough for grass to start growing around it. And he thinks he knows exactly what this was. During his visit to the site, he saw some PVC pipes stacked in an adjoining field that belonged to the local water authority. Because of this, he thought that the tracks were actually just impressions from the pipes that likely were stored there, then illegally moved. The rung-like markings were actually just bands holding the stacks together, and the diamond-shaped holes along the tracks. These, Stewart claimed, were likely a tool such as a pick being used to pry something like stakes from the ground, which may have been holding the bands down. But what about the damage to Bob's trousers? Well, according to Stewart, there's no proof that they were actually damaged during whatever happened to Bob that day. They could have either been damaged before the incident, or Bob could have just caught them on some barbed wire, or during his stumbling and disorientated journey home through the woods. Or they could even have been ripped, Stewart argues, by Lara the dog tugging on them while trying to wake Bob up from a fit. The only problem with this theory is that nearly all aspects of this theory are hot garbage when subjected to scrutiny. Let's start with the trousers. The trousers were not ripped before the incident, or Bob and Mary would have noticed. Lara didn't rip the trousers, or the forensics report would have picked up on it. The trousers weren't torn on fencing. Forensic scientist Lester Knibb pointed out that whatever had made the distinctive S-shaped tears came from a mechanical type of action, from something hooking on or grabbing the fabric and moving up. He specifically pointed out that barbed wire couldn't have made the sort of clean tears that was seen through Bob's trousers and long johns either. PC Ian Walk disputes Stewart's claim the tracks were made by something laying in the grass, so long that the grass had grown around it, pointing out that the grass in the clearing was still fresh and green when he'd examined the site, not yellowing as he'd expect from something having been laying there for a long amount of time. And as an investigating officer at the scene of the crime, his word has some weight. He also pointed out that the diamond-shaped holes were not likely to have been created by a pick, as the diameter of the holes were 3 inches, meaning they'd have to be gigantic big picks.
We ain't found shit!
And the holes were so uniform that at first the police mistook them for caterpillar tracks. Bob didn't see any pipes during previous visits, and he knew the area better than most people. And as for the workmen who Stewart suspected were illegally storing pipes in the clearing, Stewart actually confronted them and they denied this, and he straight up just accuses them of lying. Imagine that, you're just doing your job and along comes a UFO skeptic, which is really just a ufologist with extra steps, and he starts like cross-examining you like a detective from L.A. Noire.
You're full of shit, Jacob. The truth is you hated that bitch.
What about the astronomical mirage theory itself? Well, while making the documentary The West Lothian Question, the filmmakers tested Stewart's hypothesis with a planetarium and an actual astronomer, Terry Moseley, who proved that Venus was very low in the sky on the morning of 1979. It's usually only visible in the day when it's high in the sky, meaning that it probably wouldn't be seen at all. Further to this, he also pointed out that Venus was shining at half its normal brightness at that time and doing so while very close to the sun, which, by the way, was shining 6.3 billion times brighter than Venus that day. Basically, it would be impossible for anyone to see Venus in the day under these conditions. Also, Moseley pointed out that the whole astronomical mirage hypothesis was so highly unlikely that it was more or less impossible. There's never been a recorded case where atmospheric lensing, like Stewart describes, has ever happened. In order for it to even be possible, there'd need to be a giant lens in the sky. Secondly, the idea that Bob suffered an epileptic fit after witnessing said phenomena also has some problems. As Bob himself pointed out, he'd never had a fit, not before the incident, and not since. Although Stewart did consult a medical expert with his theory, Bob's own doctor went on record to say that it's highly unlikely that someone having meningitis 9 years prior would suddenly result in a black swan epileptic fit event. Especially as, again, he'd never had a fit before or after. And Stewart also admits that a subsequent examination showed no abnormal brain activity. Most importantly, Bob didn't see anything in the sky, despite nearly everyone, including myself, referring to this as a UFO event. At no point did Bob see anything fly. Even though various artwork and reconstruction show or mention the object Bob saw hovering or flying, something that kept tripping me up when I was trying to write this bloody script. Bob has never changed his original story. He has always maintained that it was sitting in the grass, not hovering over it. I think it's funny how in his book Malcolm Robinson investigates and rates the various theories out of 10. This theory got 0 out of 10. In that spirit, I'm starting another tier list, and I'm placing this right at the bottom. D. One of the more convincing theories is that this whole event, or at least part of it, took place entirely inside Bob's mind. Hear me out. The theory begins to take shape when you take into account these factors. 1. Bob fought in World War II, took part in D-Day and the Normandy landings, was at Dunkirk, and fought all the way across Europe as a tank driver. You've likely read enough books or seen enough movies to guess at the long-term psychological impact of these kind of wartime experiences. Add to this, Bob was one of the first to reach the concentration camp at Belsen, where an estimated 50,000 people died in horrific conditions, and he was there to see it burn to the ground once the survivors were evacuated. Thus, Bob had experienced one of the most horrific periods in human history, saw a lot of death, a lot of explosions, seen man's utter inhumanity to man laid bare, and was at the mercy of frightening and powerful machines constantly for a long period of time, until he was spat back out into a normal, quiet existence. Now, I can't imagine what that might do to someone's psyche, but what I can imagine is that such trauma would eventually find an outlet. P-Funk?
Ganja is a bird, this is herb.
Does it matter to you that it's still against the law here in Jamaica?
Every law is illegal.
Every law is illegal?
Every government upon the face of this earth today is illegal.
The 1970s were an interesting time in the UK for lovers of mind-bending substances. The emerging popularity of Bob Marley and reggae had introduced a whole new generation to Mary Jane, and not just the kind that Spider-Man loves. Add to this, at this time, a man, a myth, and a legend known as Howard Marks was selling insane amounts of the stuff all across the UK. The lore of Howard Marks is a bit too much to go into here. If you're interested, let me know and I may do a deep dive on my countryman at some point. But for now, just know that he was very famous for being the UK's most prolific purveyor of the sticky icky. And in 1979 specifically, he was highly active in Scotland. On New Year's Eve that year, he allegedly enlisted the aid of a bunch of US Marines to smuggle a huge amount of weed into the west coast. An amount so gigantic was smuggled through Scotland that Marks boasted that it was enough to get the entire population of the United Kingdom simultaneously stoned. Howard Marks never mentions Livingston as a smuggling location. I've pored extensively over his biography, Mr. Nice, to no avail, but it's worth pointing out that Livingston is pretty much dead centre between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and the location where Bob saw the UFO is just off the M8 motorway. And if some guy with his dog were to wander on by, get a big contact high, while the smuggler was parked off the road and having a smoke, and the guy suddenly started screaming about aliens before getting himself tangled on a fence and passing out, then that would be his cue to get on out of Dodge without leaving a trace. And if you don't like that theory, try this one on. November is prime time for the emergence of psychedelic mushrooms known as Liberty Cabs. Decmont Hill would be the perfect location for these to grow, and the animal dung left by the cattle whose job it was for Bob to wrangle would make the perfect base for it to grow in. Belladonna has also been noted to grow around Decmont Hill, which can act as a potent hallucinogen if ingested. However, it's unlikely that Bob was just wandering around eating random mushrooms and berries and breathing in pot smoke from passing Welsh weed barons. As fun as the idea is, it's just not that likely that Bob was tripping balls. There's no real evidence to back it up. Later medical tests didn't detect anything, and it doesn't account for the physical evidence at the scene of the incident. So this theory gets a C, but only because it involves Howard Marks, which would make anything cooler. If you don't like the chemical explanation and prefer a more physical nuts and bolts theory, then I've got one for you. Bob didn't see an alien spacecraft, he saw a man-made, state-of-the-art, experimental machine. It would be unlikely for a man out walking the woods in a remote place such as Decmont was in the 70s to run into a secret government program, but not that unlikely. You see, back in the post-war period, where the government was building new towns across Scotland, it was also building a warren of secret nuclear bunkers and underground complexes. It was also working with the US government to allow US military ops to surveil the Soviet Union from Scottish bases. And I know this will be really unpopular, but a downed surveillance balloon would actually be a really good explanation. Let me explain. Back when Livingston was just a twinkle in the eye of the Livingston Development Corporation, the US military was launching hundreds of spy balloons from bases all over the world, including RAF Eventon, an airfield in the Scottish Highlands. The operation was part of a joint US Army, Navy, Air Force and CIA program to assess and monitor Soviet nuclear capabilities by balloon. It was codenamed Project Genitrix. Around 500 balloons were released from bases all over the world, with a sizable portion launching from Eventon. Of the 500 launched, only one balloon actually managed to make it all the way there and to the pickup point to be collected mid-air by a C-119 boxcar. The rest crashed shortly after takeoff, or into the ocean, or onto the country they were spying on. The Soviet Union was so aware of the secret program that they not only collected what seemed to be dozens as proof, but they also ended up taking them apart and using the materials in their own technology. 40 square frames of radiation-resistant film captured from a Genitrix balloon was even used in the Soviets' lunar-free probe, which was the first to take photos of the dark side of the moon. The Soviets complained to the UN, the Americans said they were just civilian scientific research balloons, and the project was shut down by the US Air Force on March 1st, 1956. By the 70s, the airfield at Eventon had been sold off and turned into an industrial estate, so we know with certainty that Bob didn't encounter a spy balloon launched from Eventon. But there were other US bases in Scotland at that time, we'll get into that in a minute, where balloons could have been launched from. An off-course spy balloon with heavy surveillance equipment would explain some of what Bob saw. It could even be argued that the two balls which attacked Bob were actually just parachutes deploying and getting caught by a gust of wind. As for why there would be no tracks left behind, well, perhaps a balloon simply did what it's designed to do and took to the air as the day got warmer, or it was retrieved by a passing plane or helicopter, as Project Genitrix balloons were designed for. But generally, we know that the US government had moved way beyond spy balloons by the late 70s, and the embarrassment of Project Genitrix being so publicly revealed had made balloons seem pretty risky. At this point, surveillance technology in use and development had moved on to spy satellites and spy planes, and we have plenty of photographic evidence of what was being developed at that time. There's no proof that the Russians were using balloons either. It's possible that Bob encountered a spy balloon that day, but it's just not that likely. We have detailed records for every balloon launched by Genitrix, and we also have a lot of detail about how much trouble it was trying to launch balloons in Scottish weather in the first place. I mean, I should point out that the first air-to-air kill by an F-22 fighter was a spy balloon, and that happened in 2023, so it's not impossible that balloons were still being used in 1979. So we'll give this one C. One of the reasons Scotland was so important to the US military was its strategic location close to the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, where ships and submarines from both the USA and USSR would have to cross to launch nuclear strikes at the time. So while the new towns were being constructed across Scotland, the country was also quietly becoming a frontline in the Cold War between the West and Russia. Scotland wasn't just perfectly placed to monitor Soviet shipping routes, it was also a convenient launching point for nuclear bombs. So a huge US military base, housing up to 3,000 Americans, called Fleet Ballistic Missile Refit Site 1, was operated off Holy Loch, or Loch Holy, just 75 miles from Livingston, where an arsenal of Polaris nuclear missile submarines were also docked. Holy Loch was easily the most important military base in the UK, if not the Western world, and as well as easy access to monitoring and launching of attacks and reprisals, it also served as a magnet that would draw enemy missiles away from the mainland USA, so they could blow up Scotland instead. Just really nice of them. This is one reason the base was hugely controversial at the time, although hilariously, some locals were just angry that they weren't allowed in because the Americans had their own restaurants and bars where they served American stuff.
The Scots are only allowed in when they've got an American to sign them in. The Americans can come out and in all our pubs whenever they want to, with no trouble at all, but us we're not allowed in their places. They've got their own food stores and all the rest of it. Scots aren't allowed in there either.
And this base is just the tip of the iceberg. Scotland is dotted with remnants of Cold War era military installations. These ROC, or Royal Observer Corps, nuclear monitoring posts, are basically fallout shelters, and they're everywhere. These days, these ROC posts are closed and bolted, mostly visited by urban explorers, but in 1979 it's possible that Bob could have stumbled onto a bunker, either an ROC post or a secret underground nuclear bunker. That statement may sound silly, but Decmont Hill is only 20 miles away from Barnton Bunker, which at one point was one of Britain's most secret and huge nuclear bunkers. Originally it was designed to house the Queen, a fully functioning BBC studio, and 400 politicians in the event of a nuclear attack, and Barnton was still active until the early 80s before it fell into disuse and abandonment. It's possible that a location such as an ROC bunker or secret nuclear facility, and there are rumours of a second bunker like Barnton that was never found, could have been the home base for a military op that involved testing a new type of vehicle or drone. This theory was put to Malcolm by a trusted source of his that Bob had actually been attacked by an experimental anti-tank vehicle that had been deployed from a nearby secret Ministry of Defence facility. The vehicle was designed to be deployed and collected by helicopter, thus explaining why there were no tracks. The balls that attacked Bob were mines designed to latch onto enemy tanks. The anonymous source even pointed to Jane's All-World Aircraft, an annual aviation journal, where they claimed there was an article explaining that the military abandoned further development of the vehicle because during testing it kept wandering onto motorways and attacking random people.
Come on, man, move this thing! I can't! It's a Geo!
On the surface, this theory seems like a slam dunk, but Malcolm couldn't find the vehicle described by the source mentioned in their email, and neither has anyone else. And there's been a lot of eyes on this case over the years. Nothing in any of the almanacs mentioned from 79 to 81 contain anything like what attacked Bob. We know for a fact that the UK MOD was experimenting with secret drone tech at the time, but the pictures that we have of this don't really come anywhere close to what Bob saw. Whatever Bob saw that day was streets ahead of anything that the MOD may have been working on at that time. There's always been a strong US military presence in the UK, so it's possible this could have been a US military op, but still, nothing like what Bob described has ever been witnessed in action by the US military since, and there'd be some evidence or some trace if this vehicle had ever been around, even if it were secret. As for the secret military base from which this super weapon may have been launched, we now have pretty extensive knowledge of every bunker and ROC post in Scotland, even though more occasionally show up from time to time. But it's unlikely that Bob stumbled onto one that day because he knew those woods better than anyone, and he probably would have seen it before or after. Also, we know that Bob remembers exactly where the incident happened. When Malcolm Drummond first sent his workers to the woods and they didn't find anything, Bob went back out with them to show them exactly where it had happened, and it was then that they saw the tracks. Finally, although a secret military weapon is one of the most logical explanations, it would also be the most illogical thing to attack someone on the side of the M8 motorway. If the government, either UK or US, was testing such a thing, there would be much better locations to do so, like this. So secret bunker gets a D rating, but secret government weapon gets a B rating. It gets a higher rating than anything we've seen before because Bob was adamant that what he saw was a physical nuts and bolts machine, even though the technology clearly didn't exist at the time. But we don't even need a malevolent actor for a man-made explanation. Let me introduce you to something other than drugs that were popular in the 70s that made people think they were being attacked by aliens. Ladies and gentlemen, the Futurro House. In 1968, a Finnish artist called Matti Suurinen, I think I said that right, was commissioned to design an all-weather ski cabin that could be put up in the roughest of terrain with relative ease. Inspired by the science fiction ideas of the time and the ongoing space race, he came up with the Futurro House, or pod, a plastic, modular, UFO-shaped house that could be built in a factory and airlifted to a location by helicopter, where a small waiting crew could easily assemble the rest. It's hard to pin down exactly how many were built, but it's likely only under 100. The oil crisis of 1973 caused the price of oil to skyrocket and plastic products fell out of favour, with the Futurro becoming too expensive for the mass market. These were pretty rare even in 1979, but there were a few reports of these popping up around the UK in the years before and after the Livingston event, with one appearance possibly being the cause for another famous UFO sighting of the 70s. But I won't get into that here as that story deserves a whole video of its own. Let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in hearing that one. Back to the Futurro House, it's impossible not to note the similarity to what Bob saw. A Futurro House would also explain the tracks that were left behind. If it were moved while Bob was still unconscious, some indents in the ground would be all that remained. This would also corroborate Stuart Campbell's long-held theory that the tracks were left behind by something heavy that had been stored there illegally, then hastily moved. I thought it was too great a coincidence that this thing exists and could hypothetically have been at this location at this time, that I looked into how quickly a Futurro house could be erected and moved. Now, we know Bob was only unconscious for around 20 minutes, and a Futurro house would take at least a crew of 3, around 3 hours to disassemble and move. Even if you could move one in 20 minutes, it would probably take so many people or heavy machinery that there'd be tracks left behind. And we know that there weren't. It's possible that a Futurro house could be picked up by helicopter. This was one of the most fundamental design features. This would also explain the whooshing sound Bob heard while passing out. But the Futurro house as a cause wouldn't really explain anything else, such as the sea mine-like entities that attacked Bob and left physical markings on his trousers. It would also be extremely unusual and overly coincidental for a helicopter to fly over Livingston next to the M8 motorway in the middle of the day and to just hook onto a UFO-looking house and just fly away over the horizon, without at least one other person seeing it and saying, "Wow, that's a bit odd." There's obvious problems with all the man-made theories, really. It's been over 45 years since then, and there's just nothing man-made that both looks and acts like what Bob described. No experimental vehicle has since gone into production or been declassified that in any way resembles what Bob saw. And the Futurro house, although somewhat similar to what Bob saw, wouldn't explain everything else around the case. But Bob has always maintained that what he saw was a physical, nuts and bolts object, and man-made objects exist, so the man-made theory deserves at least a C rating. C. If you're still watching at this point, I'd like to say thank you for supporting me with your click. I appreciate you watching until the end, and as a treat for doing so, I made you something. I have a whole new theory about this case that's never been floated. Now, before I do this, I'd just like to say, this is just for fun, so please don't sue me for suggesting this, but remember how Malcolm Drummond, that's Bob's boss at the LDC, was so insistent on calling the police, even though there's nothing to show that Bob and Mary asked him to do so, and how someone from the LDC continuously pestered the press just hours after the event? Didn't all that seem just a bit weird? I mean, here we have a town that's just been built, and this incredible event happens, and the company that built the town seems to subtly want to promote the event to as many people as possible. Isn't it strange how a crew from the LDC were actually the first ones to arrive on the scene, and we just have to take their word for it that there wasn't a structure sitting there, which they could easily have picked up and removed, as easily as they moved Bob's car. Isn't it interesting that the only people who knew that Bob was in the woods at that exact location were so heavily involved in this situation? I know that's a lot of leading questions, but I'm trying to take you as close to the looking glass as possible with this one, legally speaking. A few years before Bob sighted a UFO, a circle of ancient standing stones was found in Livingston, alongside the banks of Loch Shot Burn. Although it was first believed that these were old stones erected by long-dead people, it would later transpire that they'd actually been built by the LDC and planted there as part of an ongoing beautification campaign that had begun back in 1973 when the LDC had appointed a town artist, Dennis Barn. Throughout the 70s, Barnes created a series of sculptures and art all across Livingston on behalf of the LDC, sometimes working with up to 30 artists. Now, if a company was willing to fake standing stones, why not fake a UFO sighting by pranking an employee and using them as a useful idiot to spread the story? It would be pretty easy. You would just need some fiberglass and a light. The Loch Ness Monster brought countless tourist money to Inverness, so why not a UFO in Livingston to create some local colour or a sense of cultural identity? We know they already did this with the standing stones, so if the LDC had ever considered this idea, Barnes and his team are the ones who would have been approached to create something that could blow a simple man's mind. So I'm not really accusing them, I'm just saying that they would be the most likely suspect. And with up to 30 artists working together and a few phone calls from a certain manager, it would be totally possible to quickly construct something like the Futurro home and have enough time to move it, leaving nothing but the impression of the ground where it had been. But perhaps somewhere along the way their chosen target got hurt, and over time the corporation, realizing its liability, backed further and further away from any responsibility, and by the time it dissolved, there wasn't really any paper trail left and no living witnesses to the conspiracy. Just a few weirdos on YouTube talking about 40-year-old trousers. This may be the craziest idea I've ever come up with, and there's a reason I placed it at the end like an Easter egg when everyone else has already clicked on to the next video. But I've got to say, the pieces are all there. This could all just be a prank played on Bob with the hope of getting some attention that could bring in tourists and money to a small town with, let's be honest, not a lot going on. And of course, this is the only course of events that don't involve aliens, secret government experiments, unprecedented solar events that are only visible to one person in the entire world.
Good time was had by all. I'm pooped.
Yes, I should be. Good Lord, what is happening in there?
Astronomical mirage. Astronomical mirage theory.
At this time of year, at this time of day, in this part of the country, localized entirely within
Decmont law.
Yes.
May I see it?
No.
And if this is true, it would also explain why Malcolm Drummond was so heavily all up in Bob's shit, and why years later, the LDC acted so strangely about erecting a plaque saying that one of their employees saw a UFO, when they were the ones who pushed him to say it. I've also found some kind of shady stuff around the LDC, basically being subject to the Official Secrets Act, with a lot of their records sealed for decades. I'm only semi-serious, it's just a fun observation. The case is very much unsolved, with every theory more or less on the table until someone comes up with definitive proof, then pretty much anything is possible. As of now, there is no S-tier theory that takes into account all the physical proof while explaining what Bob saw. That is, unless you believe in interdimensional, non-human entities. And because I really don't want to get sued, I'm not gonna actually grade the LDC corporate fuckery theory, so just cross that one off. The most important thing to note is that none of the theories raised accuse Bob of lying. For the rest of his life, he told the same story. To police, to reporters, to ufologists, to skeptics, and even his own family and closest friends. His wife believed him, his family believed him, his colleagues believed him, the police believed him, even the skeptics believed him. Out of the whole cast of colourful characters who've discussed Bob's case over the years, obviously there's been much disagreement about the cause of Bob's sighting. But one thing every single person agrees on: Bob Taylor was not a liar. We may never know exactly what he saw that day in November 1979, be it an experimental vehicle, a hallucination, interdimensional aliens with big balls, or a fiberglass mold with a light in it. But one thing's for sure, Bob saw something. I don't know what it was. It's likely nobody ever will. The only thing we know for sure is that it probably wasn't fucking Venus.